A routine survey at an abandoned school unexpectedly uncovered something no one had dared to imagine. Riggs, a German shepherd with eyes deep as memory, stopped before a crumbling wall and gently pawed at the tiled floor. Behind the worn bricks, a red suitcase appeared. Inside lay the answer to a disappearance that had left an entire town breathless. With nothing more than a silent gaze and steady steps, Riggs opened the door to a truth that time itself had tried to bury. Helmsford High stood in silence, nestled deep within a forest of red maples. Its dark moss-covered roof sloped beneath the soft autumn light, while old dust-frosted window panes reflected a glow so faint it seemed to preserve fragments of time itself. Once a prestigious emblem of the Northeast, Helmsford had welcomed generations of elite students clad in deep blue and pale yellow plaid uniforms, their footsteps echoing down long brick-lined corridors. But today, there were no echoes, no ringing of bells. The school had been shut down 2 years ago following a string of financial scandals and a controversial shift in investment control. The renovation plans, frozen for months, were finally resuming. Outside, a truck from the architectural survey team rolled to a stop at the foot of the weather-worn steps, now buried beneath brittle leaves. 3 figures in silver-gray uniforms began unloading equipment with practiced care. Leading them was Chief Engineer Wallace, calm, observant, his eyes scanning every cracked tile and uneven brick. At his side walked a silent partner, Riggs, a German shepherd with a thick coat of black and ash-gray fur. His posture steady, movements graceful, gliding across the earth as if sensing more than sight alone could reveal. Riggs had once served as a K-9 tracker with Vermont's Mountain Rescue Unit, credited with saving dozens stranded in snowstorms. After retirement, he was adopted by a local technical officer, the same one who had brought him along today, trusting his presence not just as a companion, but as a silent guardian. The team's official task was to assess the building's foundation, but Wallace knew from experience Riggs's instincts were rarely wrong, especially in aging structures where the threat of collapse wasn't always visible. The basement entrance lay behind the school's old chapel, where a narrow moss-covered path led to a steel door veined with cracks like frozen blood vessels. As the heavy door groaned open, the scent of mold and aged timber surged upward. Wallace switched on his flashlight. The dim beam swept across rusted lockers, sagging bookshelves, and water-stained boxes scattered along the stone floor. Riggs moved slowly, his head low, ears forward, paws silent on the cold tile like a shadow drifting across forgotten ground. Each time the beam caught on a warped wall or sunken patch of floor, Riggs paused, head tilted, nose raised, as if weighing something that couldn't be seen. The basement branched into 3 hallways. The second one was narrower, cleaner, less dust on the ground as if someone had passed through recently. Wallace leaned closer to inspect the brickwork while Riggs turned left and entered the corridor. Then he froze. No bark, no growl. Just a sudden stillness, every muscle taut, like a wire stretched to its limit. His nose pressed to the tiles, then swung sharply toward the right, toward a wall layered with moss and time-worn dust. Riggs stood unmoving for a few seconds. Then gently, he began to scratch. The first paw, tentative like testing. The second, firmer claws scraping the crumbling cement. His tail rose, eyes fixed on a single point in the wall. Wallace followed his gaze and placed a hand where Riggs had touched. There it was, a faint indentation and something else, a chill seeping through an unseen gap. There might be a sealed corridor or old partition behind this, Wallace muttered, signaling for the vibration scanner. But before the device could be set up, Riggs kept digging, methodically, insistently, his every movement quiet but urgent, as if trying to speak in a language no one else understood. One technician chuckled dryly. Probably just a dead rat behind the wall. Wallace didn't respond. He knelt instead, meeting Riggs's gaze. In the beam of his flashlight, the dog's eyes reflected no fear, no anxious twitch. Only one thing: resolve. That eerie, determined silence that made Wallace's skin tighten. There was something behind that wall. Something long forgotten. He made the call to drill. As the drill bit met the concrete, a sharp echo filled the hallway. Riggs stepped back slightly, then sat gaze never leaving the wall. Dust clouded the air, and then faint red paint emerged beneath the crumbling layer. No one spoke. The air thickened, and the only sound was Riggs's steady breath and the clinking rhythm of steel against old brick. A breeze slipped through the hallway, whispering dry leaves against the rusted door. Riggs blinked once, then refocused. Watching. Waiting. For something buried too long beneath layers of dust and silence no one had ever stopped to hear. He didn't move, and the wall slowly began to break apart under the drill's weight. The final piece fell with a brittle snap, revealing a dark hollow within. The flashlight beam swept inside, landing on a faded red leather suitcase, scratched, worn, speckled with marks that looked too much like dried blood. The air turned heavy. No one moved. Because what gripped them wasn't the sight. It was the feeling. The sense that this thing had been waiting. Riggs stepped forward. No barking, no tension. Just a slow approach, head lowered, and a gentle nudge of his nose against the rusted handle. That single motion, quiet and precise, made Wallace's spine run cold. He gestured the others back and carefully opened the suitcase. The hinges cracked. Inside lay a small figure curled into a faded white dress. Bones frail and drawn inward, as if she had tried to make herself invisible at the edge of the world. A broken necklace slipped through the fabric. Its turquoise pendant cracked, bearing only half a name, Ra J. At the base of the suitcase, a folded piece of paper still pressed into the lining. Wallace picked it up with care, unfolding it gently. The writing, trembling, faded, water-streaked, read, "I knocked." Many times. But no one heard. No one moved. Riggs sat down beside Wallace, his eyes locked on the white dress, calm yet deep. Like an old quiet well that held more than water. One of the younger engineers whispered, his voice trembling, "Could it be Clara?" Wallace didn't answer immediately, but the name echoed clearly in his mind. Clara Jennings, the student who vanished on senior night 6 years ago. It was a disappearance that shook Helmsford to its core. They had searched everything, including the basement. They brought in lights, search dogs, even dismantled parts of the drainage system. And when nothing turned up, the conclusion was clear. Clara must have run away. But now, here was her suitcase, barely 5 meters from where the original search had taken place, hidden behind nothing more than a single layer of old brick. "Why didn't we find her back then?" the same engineer blurted out. Wallace took a deep breath. Not because of the question, but because of Riggs's eyes. Still unchanged, still focused, as if he had known all along that something vital was buried there. Not the scent of a body, but the echo of a call no one had answered. "She didn't leave," Wallace said softly. "She was trapped. And she knocked. Many times." The air thickened. Every eye turned toward the faded note, where shaky pencil strokes now stood as testimony to what Clara had tried so desperately to say. A paper evidence bag was brought in. Wallace carefully placed the items inside, one by one: the white dress, the broken necklace, the note. The remains were left for the forensic team to handle, but Wallace lingered a little longer. He didn't walk away. Riggs remained by his side, guarding the tiny space like a portal that opened not into another room, but into a moment that had never truly closed. Then, a sound. Metal brushing metal. A small nail dropped from the upper edge of the broken wall, followed by a faint noise like footsteps echoing far away down the other end of the basement corridor. Riggs blinked. He lifted his head, turned, and began walking toward the sound. Not fast, not startled, but with purpose. Wallace followed immediately. Something wasn't finished here. The flashlight cut through the cold corridor. Dust swirled like mist as the wind filtered through a cracked vent. Riggs turned left, stopping in front of an old wooden door that led to the storage shed behind the school. The wood had rotted and the iron lock dangled loose. He didn't scratch. He just stood there, ears tilted, listening for something unseen. Wallace stepped forward and placed his hand on the handle. Whatever was inside didn't feel the same. Clara's story had only just begun. The next morning, a blanket of mist clung low over the maple trees at the edge of the Helmsford property. Forensics police and reporters had already arrived, circling the basement entrance where the red suitcase had been discovered. Inside a parked SUV near the courtyard, Wallace sat in silence, eyes fixed on the fogged windshield, staring at the old schoolyard. Beside him, Riggs lay curled up, head resting gently on Wallace's boot, dark brown eyes half open, watching something no one else could see. The preliminary forensic report arrived sooner than expected. Just a few pages. But one name changed everything. Clara Jennings, age 17, senior class 12A, missing since October 2019. Wallace nodded quietly and placed the file in his lap. He still remembered her face, bright and hopeful in the school's welcome banner, with soft brown curls and pale blue eyes, like an early winter lake. Clara had been a high-achieving student from a well-off family and had no history of trouble. The night she vanished, the school had been hosting a senior celebration outdoors. Lights strung across the courtyard, music playing from loudspeakers. Everyone assumed she had left early to meet friends. But the next morning, her dorm room was empty. No suitcase, no phone, no note. The investigation had begun immediately. Police combed the security footage, interviewed friends, searched the woods, and even dove into the lake behind the school. K-9 units were deployed too, but after 3 days without a single lead, the trail went cold. Speculation spread. Some said Clara had been lured away by someone online. Others believed she ran off after a family dispute. A few teachers mentioned she'd seemed quieter in the weeks before her disappearance. But no one looked closely enough. 8 months later, the case was officially closed. The name Clara Jennings was filed away, listed among hundreds of American teenagers who vanished without explanation each year. And now, 6 years later, her name returned. Not in a letter, not in a news report, but in a red suitcase behind a wall they had searched before and left behind. Wallace turned toward Riggs, still lying quietly beside him. He placed a hand gently along the dog's back, stroking the thick fur down his spine. "You knew, didn't you?" he murmured. Riggs didn't react, just blinked slowly. What haunted Wallace most wasn't that they had found the suitcase. It was that Riggs had led them straight to it, with unwavering certainty, even though he'd never been trained to track the dead. Riggs was a rescue K-9, trained to find the living, victims of avalanches, earthquakes, missing hikers in the forest. Every exercise, every mission was built around the scent of survival. And yet, Riggs had responded to something that no longer lived. Something had remained in that basement. Not breath, not sound, but perhaps a presence. A trace of memory embedded in stone. Or maybe something only dogs could perceive. The ache of despair still lingering in the air, undisturbed for years. The local sheriff's office called. They needed a full incident report to update the old case file. Wallace nodded and reached for the phone, but his eyes never left Riggs, as if waiting to see if the dog would stir again. Downstairs in the ground floor hallway, a young forensic officer approached holding the cracked turquoise pendant in her gloved hand. "There's something scratched on the back," she said softly. "Looks like she did it herself." Faint, but still readable. She handed Wallace a close-up photo. Beneath the fractures in the stone, a line of shaky lettering was just visible. "If anyone finds this, please don't stay silent." Wallace froze, his eyes shut for the briefest of moments. A sentence from someone who had been silenced for far too long, now heard again. Not in words, but in instinct, in breath. In the gaze of a creature that had never forgotten how to listen to what others overlook. Riggs stretched his legs and stood up, eyes fixed on the hallway exit. He began walking, slowly, toward the path that led to the rear storage wing of Helmsford, where he had stopped the night before just after finding the suitcase. Where he had waited still and alert. Wallace didn't speak. He rose and followed. Maybe Clara had knocked. Maybe Riggs had heard. And maybe what they were about to find wasn't a memory of the lost, but the voice of someone still alive. It was just past noon. The sun sagged behind the trees, casting slanted rays through the broken glass of the school's abandoned gym sheds. The area once used for sports equipment, old lab gear, and leftover supplies when the school shut down hadn't seen footsteps in years. Wallace had just stepped out of the main coordination office when he saw Riggs standing still in the corridor that led toward the storage rooms. The dog hadn't moved, his back slightly arched body taut, like a string pulled to its final note. A breeze rushed in from behind, ruffling the fur on Riggs' neck in a rippling wave of instinct. "Riggs," Wallace called quietly, walking toward him. But Riggs didn't turn. His gaze stayed locked on an old wooden door at the far end of the corridor. A door stained dark brown, flaking with age, its rusted lock hanging askew. The hallway around them was dead silent. The only sound being Riggs's claws tapping the floor as he began moving forward one deliberate step at a time. When he was only a few meters from the door, Riggs let out a sharp whine. It was high-pitched, quick, like an alarm. He turned slightly, one paw scraping the ground, then let out another longer cry, this time slicing the quiet like a blade. The technical crew, just returning to install vibration monitors, froze mid-step. "What was that? Riggs has never made that sound before," one of them gasped, dropping his equipment. Wallace moved fast. Riggs had stopped moving, but was now furiously scratching at the ground before the door claws, hitting the tile with a dry, urgent rhythm. His body lowered, muscles locked in place, not to flee, but to brace. Yet his eyes never left that locked wooden door. No gas leak, no visible structural hazard. Everything was still. But Wallace saw it now. This wasn't fear. It was a warning. "Maybe it's a raccoon or some kind of animal," one of the crew offered, voice shaky. But Riggs suddenly let out a third whine, longer, sharper. He stepped back, then lunged forward again, striking the door with enough force to splinter the rotting wood. His eyes remained fixed on the space between the bottom of the door and the floor, a narrow crack just wide enough for a fingertip. Wallace knelt and pointed his flashlight into the gap. The beam dissolved into blackness. Riggs scratched again, once sharply, and stopped. Then turned to Wallace, locking eyes in a steady, wide gaze. And in that moment, Wallace understood. Riggs was asking him, no telling him, to open that door. Now. Wallace reached for the padlock. Though rusted, it snapped open with ease, as if it had never been locked at all, just made to look like it. That realization sent a chill down his spine. He paused before opening the door. Riggs stepped back slightly, giving space, but still watching that gap unblinking. His posture was ready. Not defensive, but purposeful, as if something inside needed help. Wallace placed his hand on the old wooden handle. One breath in, then he pushed. The door creaked open with a strangled groan, and a rush of stale, ancient air spilled out, thick with dust mold and something else, impossible to name. No one stepped inside right away. Riggs was first, moving slowly, nose brushing low to the ground. One step, then another. The room was pitch black. And then, just as Riggs reached a tattered rug in the center, he gave a low, trembling whimper, almost like a sob. Then from the far end of the room, a faint clink. Metal on concrete, like a chain. Wallace froze. Riggs snapped his head toward the sound and let out a low growl, then charged forward, toward a smaller door tucked behind a decaying curtain. Wallace followed his flashlight, now shaking in his hand. The door was old, narrow, and unlocked. Riggs scratched at it once, quick and sharp, then stopped. And then, from the other side came a voice. Faint, hoarse, barely a whisper. Please, someone was still alive. The door creaked open, the hinges screaming against the silence that had ruled for far too long. The flashlight beam swept into a suffocatingly small space. No windows, 4 cracked gray walls, a ceiling so low it seemed to press downward. There in the center, a girl lay curled on her side. Her wrists and ankles were bound. Silver duct tape fraying was stretched across her mouth. Her eyes were wide, terrified, and her entire body trembled as if waiting for the next terrible thing. She flinched at the light, unable to tell if rescue or danger had come. Wallace stood frozen, his breath caught. The girl didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply stared. Eyes hollow from too many nights without answers, too many hours inside walls that no one heard. Riggs stepped into the room first, silent. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He only walked gently to the girl, lowered himself, and touched his nose softly to her wrist, right where the rope had bitten into her skin. She flinched, her entire body seizing up, but only for a moment. And then she broke. Not in quiet sobs, but in a full guttural cry, a sound torn from the depth of a soul that had been silenced too long. It wasn't grief. It was release, like the walls inside her had finally cracked. Wallace rushed forward, gently peeling the tape from her mouth, then quickly cutting the cords around her wrists and ankles. The girl collapsed onto the cold tile floor, sobbing and crawling backward on instinct, like fear still clung to every breath she took. "You're safe now," Wallace said calmly. "I'm Wallace. The police and medics are on their way. My name is Aria Bell." She gasped, her voice dry and broken. He... Riggs was already lying beside her, head resting on her leg. His eyes had softened, no longer sharp but gentle, like a warm presence shielding her without a word. Wallace felt the name hit like a jolt. Aria Bell. The 18-year-old girl who had gone missing 2 days ago, a senior from a high school more than 20 miles away. Her missing poster had still been hanging on the bulletin board at the station that morning. "How did you get here?" "Who brought you?" Wallace asked, kneeling beside her. Aria shook as her purple-tinged lips tried to form words. I was drugged. It was raining. They brought me here while I was unconscious. When I woke up, I was already in that room." She gasped for air, fingers gripping Wallace's sleeve tightly, as if letting go would mean this rescue was only a dream she wasn't ready to wake from. "It was the principal," she whispered, suddenly clutching his arm. "He knew everything. It wasn't just me. There were others. Girls." He picked them, one by one. Wallace felt a shiver crawl along his scalp. "You mean the principal?" "The principal of Helmsford," he asked, barely believing the words coming out of his mouth. Arya nodded. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks. "I heard him on the phone. He said names. He said Clara, and the next one. I think I was going to be the next one to disappear." The air in the room turned frigid. There were no windows yet. It felt like a chill had swept through, cold and creeping like something ancient had stirred. Clara. That name again, spoken now by someone alive just hours after her remains had finally been found. Riggs stood by the doorway, eyes trained on the dark corridor beyond, ears perked. Not in curiosity, but like he sensed something was still dangerously close. Wallace helped Arya to her feet, draping his coat around her trembling shoulders. Her legs wobbled, steps unsure. But her eyes began to regain some clarity, and when Riggs nudged his head softly against her wrist again, she seemed to draw strength from that quiet touch, as though his presence had given her permission to keep going. From down the hallway, ambulance sirens wailed in the distance. Help was arriving. But Wallace knew what they were about to treat wasn't just a weakened body. It was the truth. And that truth had finally begun to rise through 6 years of dust. Riggs still stood in the doorway, silent, watchful, no longer waiting, but guarding, the posture of a dog that had sensed the shadow and was ready to face it. A temporary medical station had been set up inside Helmsford's old library, the scent of fresh antiseptic mixed with the musty fragrance of forgotten paper, creating an atmosphere that felt half sterile, half sorrowful. Yellowish bulbs cast soft light on rows of tarp-covered bookshelves, and faded portraits hung crooked with time. Arya Bell sat wrapped in a thick gray blanket, her body curled into a worn leather chair. A few beads of sweat still clung to her forehead, but her breathing had evened out. Before her sat Wallace and 2 senior investigators from Barronson County, dispatched immediately after word spread that a kidnapping victim had been found alive. And nestled against her feet, like a quiet, unwavering shadow, was Riggs. Since the moment she had left that windowless room, Riggs hadn't taken his eyes off her, hadn't moved more than a breath. Wallace clicked on the recorder, his voice barely above a whisper. "Arya, can you tell us everything you remember from the beginning?" She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the empty space behind Riggs's back, like she was stepping back into memories, still wet with fear. "It was Monday afternoon," she began. "I was called to the principal's office. He said there was a special scholarship, some kind of private academy program for seniors." Her fingers clutched at the edge of the blanket. "I told him I wasn't interested." He smiled, but something in his eyes felt off. Then he said, "Not everyone gets chosen, Arya. You're luckier than Clara ever was." The air in the room sank. That name, Clara, again. This time directly from the man behind it all. After that, I started feeling dizzy. I think there was something in the water. I collapsed. Everything went dark. When I woke up, I was already in that small room. No windows, no lights, just the hum of an old fan and the smell of mold. She paused. Her right hand slid gently down, resting on Riggs's head. The dog shifted slightly beneath her touch, but never looked away from her face. Someone came once a day to leave food. I never saw their face. They'd crack the door open just enough, then slam it shut again. But one day, I heard a voice outside. His voice, the principal's. She turned to Wallace, her voice now cracking. He called me a new entry. I heard him say, "This storage room is quiet enough. No one will hear anything anymore." Riggs flicked his ears, reacting to something even within her trembling tone. Wallace wrote furiously, Every detail she shared echoed what they had just learned from Clara's case, being summoned to the office, then disappearing without a trace. And now, Arya had nearly followed the same fate. One of the Berenson investigators leaned forward. "Arya, you said he mentioned Clara. Are you sure?" She nodded. No hesitation. "Anyone else?" Arya closed her eyes, her voice washed out like a wave losing strength. "He once said, some of them need to be controlled before they reach college." I don't know what he meant, but I'm sure Clara wasn't the first, and I wouldn't have been the last. Silence fell again. Outside, a breeze whistled across the cracked tiles of the library roof, letting out a sound that wasn't quite a howl. More like something trying to knock, again and again. But no one had listened. Arya opened her eyes. She tilted her head, looking at Riggs. One hand still rested on the dog's back, while the other trembled slightly. As if after so many days drowning in darkness, she was finally touching something truly safe. "If Riggs hadn't come," she whispered, "I don't think I'd be alive to say any of this." Wallace gave a quiet nod, fingers tightening around his notebook. "Riggs isn't trained for missing person recovery," he explained. "He was only ever deployed in natural disasters, in avalanche zones' rugged terrain, so the way he responded to Clara, and to Arya, that wasn't training." One of the investigators leaned in, speaking low. "Then, what do you think it was?" Wallace turned his eyes to Riggs, who sat silently near the library door. Still as a statue, his gaze fixed outward, as if waiting for something yet to arrive. "I think," Wallace said quietly, he heard what we missed. A knock. From someone still alive, and this time, he didn't let us turn away. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Helmsford's main hall, casting long blade-like beams of gold across the stone floor. Below in the basement, the investigation team had returned. But it wasn't just about Clara's case anymore. It was about uncovering everything that had once been buried. Not only beneath brick and plaster, but beneath the indifference of time. Riggs led the way. His wet nose and taut ears moved like living sensors, sweeping along each wall, scanning every inch. Wallace followed closely behind, flashlight in one hand, recorder in the other, his eyes tracking Riggs's every subtle shift. The room where the dark red suitcase had been found was now just a rough scar on the wall, surrounded by newer bricks. A frame holding the memory of something too long delayed. But Riggs stopped suddenly to the left of the original site. He sniffed, short, sharp, then let out a low whine. Wallace recognized that sound instantly. Something's wrong. A light tap on the stone wall followed. The echo was hollower than elsewhere. A technician brought a drill and began carefully removing the outer layer. Minutes later, they revealed a small cavity, about the size of a shoebox. Inside it, a silver-gray metal box, rusted but locked. They placed it gently on the table in the center of the room. Riggs sat below, eyes locked on the box still, and focused as if he already knew it contained more than just objects. Wallace used a lockpick tool. With a faint click, the latch gave way. The lid creaked open, releasing a thin stream of stale air, metal and damp paper mingling. Inside was a stack of black and white photographs, bound by a rusted clip. As Wallace lifted the first photo, the room fell into silence. 7 girls, each one dressed the same, white dresses with square collars, standing before the same backdrop, the wall behind Helmsford's main hall stage. None of them smiled. Each face was stiff eyes fixed on something just beyond the lens. Wallace flipped through the images slowly. He paused on the third. "This is Clara Jennings," he said, voice tight. "No question." Clara stood in the white dress. Her face, still childlike, seemed caught between confusion and fear. In the corner of the photo, someone had scribbled in pencil number 3, Clara. Then came the 4th photo, an unfamiliar face, a girl not found in any report. "Wait," one investigator said. "This one's not in any file." On the back, 4. M. Wallace studied her. Long, wavy hair, a small birthmark beneath her left cheek. The image was clear, too clear, but what made his spine crawl was the composition. It was identical to school portraits, same angle, same lighting, only without the smiles. "These were never meant to be seen," Wallace murmured. "Someone took these girls, put them in the same setting, same clothes, same pose, and stored them away, like records or trophies." A forensic officer stepped closer. He counted them out. 7 total, numbered from number 1 to number 7, 7 girls. "But we've only confirmed 2, Clara and Aria." Wallace nodded, turning the first photo over. On the back, 1, A. Bell. Aria was the first. Clara was 3rd. That leaves 5 more we've never identified. He laid the photographs out in order across the table. One by one, the faces emerged under the yellow overhead light. Each gaze carried its own shade of despair. But they all shared something else. Behind each girl, the same crack in the wall shaped like a Y. The same wall. The one behind the principal's podium in the Helmsford Hall. "It means they were photographed here," Wallace said grimly. "In the school. Probably at night. And each time only one copy of the photo was made." Riggs remained still, but he shifted slightly, head tilting, ears adjusting to a frequency no one else could hear. His tail gave a single twitch, not wagging, alert. An officer entered holding a thin file. "I just pulled missing persons cases from nearby schools. Last 10 years. 3 teenage girls, ages 16 to 18, vanished without trace. All within 50 miles of Helmsford. All still unsolved." He held up the photos again. "I believe these are the girls we've yet to identify." Wallace stared down at the faces, feeling like each of them was pressing up from the paper, trying to say something they once scratched against the walls. Over and over. And no one listened. "What about the last photo?" one of the detectives asked. Wallace lifted it carefully. The final image. A girl with dark brown hair, eyes staring straight into the camera. And this time, she was smiling. But it wasn't joy. It was something else. Like she recognized the person behind the lens. Like the smile wasn't for the camera, but for the one who had taken her. Riggs let out a soft whine. Wallace inhaled sharply. This might be the message, he said. Or the evidence that turns everything upside down. Early morning. A thin veil of mist hung over Helmsford Academy like a white shroud pulled over a past that refused to rest. Riggs stood on the stone steps outside the principal's office, eyes scanning the rear courtyard. Where opening ceremonies had once taken place, where students once said farewell, and where some had vanished without a word. Inside the investigation room, the air thickened. Like photographic paper waiting for an image to surface. That final photo from the metal box, the one of the girl smiling strangely, was the key. Not because of who the girl was, but because of what appeared in the background, a faint figure standing just at the edge of the frame. A man, older, wearing a gray coat with the collar pulled high, obscuring half his face. But Wallace recognized him instantly. "That's Marcus Elroy," he said. "The current principal of Helmsford." There was no clear lighting, no full face. But the posture, the thinning hair at the back of the neck, and the thick silver ring on his left hand, it was unmistakable. Wallace had seen that same ring during a parent meeting 3 years ago. The room fell silent. A cold, dreadful silence. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood if the man in the photo was Marcus, then this was no longer an isolated crime. This was a system, a chain of horrors planned and concealed. Investigator Alina opened her laptop and pulled up records of the school's extracurriculars over the last 10 years. "This is strange," she muttered. There was an off-campus retreat by Watchrow Lake. That terrain matches the background in several of the photos, but it's not listed in the school's official activity reports. Wallace leaned in. Then, who approved it? Alina clicked a few times. The proposal to host the retreat at Watchrow. It was submitted by Marcus Elroy. Helmsford was an old school, old enough that everything looked perfectly respectable, from the polished tile corridors to the pristine file systems. No student ever questioned the sight of Principal Elroy walking alone across the courtyard late at night. They assumed he was simply attentive. But that trust, that image of a man who cares about his students, was the most dangerous mask he wore. Wallace remembered during Clara's investigation, Marcus had been the first to open the faculty offices for police. He personally exported the school's CCTV footage, but somehow the footage for the afternoon Clara vanished was accidentally omitted. And Marcus was also the only one who had keys to the rear storage room, where Aria had been locked away. Riggs growled low when Wallace spoke Marcus's name. Not everyone dared suspect the principal. Not because of his title, but because of how carefully he had built his persona polite, composed, always showing up at the right moments, always praising students with special promise. "What did he say to Aria again?" Wallace murmured. "Not everyone gets chosen." Every girl in those photographs, each with a number, a stare, a posture, shared something else in common. They had all been outstanding students, top of their class, pride of the school, until they vanished. The local police, though, beginning to grow suspicious, still hesitated when Wallace requested a search warrant for Marcus Elroy's home. "We don't have direct evidence. He's a respected man," one officer said, cautious. "He is in the photo, hidden in the background behind a wall that was sealed shut," Wallace shot back. "But there's no clear face, just the back of his head and a partial ring. And this man has influence. He's a statewide Educator of the Year, honorary degrees from 3 universities. You know this won't be easy." Wallace didn't argue further. He simply turned to Riggs. The dog stood straight, eyes fixed on the school courtyard. Marcus Elroy was walking across it, heading toward his car. The sunlight caught the wide silver ring on his left hand, just for a second. Then it disappeared as the car door slammed shut. "He has 2 faces," Wallace whispered. "One for the parents and the board, kind-wise the guiding light, and one for the girls who got lost in those dark hallways, cold silent, never calling any of them by name twice." Riggs stepped forward just 1 pace toward the spot where Marcus's car had vanished. His ears stood tall, body tilted forward like he was ready to leap, toward something he had sensed long before anyone else. Wallace placed a hand gently on Riggs's back. "We'll show him," he said softly, "that every shadow has a light that follows." A stifling afternoon heat pressed down on Helmsford's northern hallway. Sunlight slanted through the tall glass panes, casting warped gold shapes across the old tile floors. Riggs moved past the administration wing, a place no one had ever suspected of hiding anything more than dusty files and outdated transcripts. But just outside Principal Elroy's office, he stopped. For the second time in 3 days, Riggs growled, not loudly, but low and tense. His legs stiffened, muscles pulled forward toward the heavy wooden door bearing a polished brass plaque, Principal. No sound came from within. The door was locked. The office was officially empty. Marcus was in town for a school board meeting. So why was Riggs reacting? Wallace appeared from the stairwell. He didn't speak, just watched. "You're sensing something again, aren't you?" he whispered. Riggs lowered his nose to the bottom corner of the door, then stepped back slightly, never taking his eyes off the handle. His body was braced, not in fear, but in certainty. He had caught a scent, faint, lingering, like old blood or terror that hadn't fully left. Down the hall, a young officer named Caleb Martin stood watching. He said nothing, just tapped his earpiece, then turned and walked away. Caleb wasn't known for talking much, but he noticed everything. He had reread Clara's file the night he arrived. And one thing kept bothering him the day Clara went missing. Every camera in the admin wing went offline for exactly 2 hours, from 3 Hadrus p.m. to 5 Hezrel p.m. What struck him most, no one had ever requested a technical review after that outage. In the main surveillance room, Caleb entered quietly, nodded at the systems manager, and logged in under the pretense of reviewing old blind spots. He didn't mention Clara or Marcus. He simply navigated to the logs for March 14th, the day Clara Jennings disappeared. The technical history didn't lie. "Manual system override," Caleb muttered. "Admin level access." Then he saw it. "User Hell Principal 01. His heart skipped. That account belonged to Marcus Elroy. Caleb sat motionless for several seconds, fingers tightening around the mouse. Then, without a word, he opened one more folder, one no one had thought to check: the backup archive. Every camera in Helmsford was connected to a mirrored backup system, but no one ever used it. It only stored footage for 48 hours before deleting automatically. Unless someone, by accident or on purpose, removed the drive and left it unplugged in a disconnected server that never got wiped. And somehow, that impossible thing had happened. The backup drive from the day Clara went missing was still there. Caleb pulled the unit, copied the data, and opened the first file. The screen flickered black for a moment, then slowly revealed a grainy image, just clear enough to see Clara Jennings entering the administration wing at 3:07 p.m. She wore a white dress. Her steps were hesitant. And behind her, Marcus Elroy followed. Elsewhere in the hallway, Riggs and Wallace stood motionless. The German shepherd hadn't taken his eyes off that office door. Almost as if, on some level, he had already seen Clara walk into that room and waited ever since for the door to open again. But that day, the door only opened once and closed. There was no footage of Clara leaving. Caleb fast-forwarded. At 5:04 p.m., the door opened again. Marcus stepped out, calm as ever, leather briefcase in hand. No Clara. That meant the door had closed twice. Once for someone to enter, once for someone to leave. And Clara never had that second time. Caleb saved the video to a separate hard drive, labeling it J14 Cam Prin L. He returned to the briefing room and handed the recording to Wallace. "I'm not sure I'm allowed to draw conclusions," Caleb said quietly. "But this is what you need to see." Wallace watched in silence, frame by frame. Riggs stood just behind his chair, resting his head gently on Wallace's arm. The footage said everything. "The door doesn't lie," Wallace murmured. He turned to Caleb. "And Riggs heard it long before we did. We just never listened. Not until now." Outside the principal's office, a gust of wind lifted the corner of a notice tacked to the hallway bulletin board. A handwritten message came into view: "Celebration Ceremony, Principal Marcus Elroy, nominee for Golden Education Medal. Next week." Wallace read it as if it were in another language. Empty, meaningless. "Maybe that ceremony will still happen," he whispered, "but not as a tribute. As the curtain call on a stage that's been left open far too long." The Helmsford Records Room sat on the ground floor of the administration building, a place rarely visited except during graduation audits or old transcript requests. Dust clung to shelf edges, paper labels had faded yellow. The only sound was the old fan turning slow arcs through the quiet, ruffling folders like breath across memory. Caleb and Wallace arrived shortly after 9 a.m. Riggs followed closely, eyes scanning each narrow aisle between the floor-to-ceiling shelves. The space felt less like an archive and more like a forgotten library. Except here, the stories weren't bound in books. They were the paper trails of lives, once reduced to data. Wallace pulled a file marked Scholarship Candidates 2017 to 2018. Clara Jennings should have been there. She had been an award-winning student, top in both math and music recognized across the state. She's not listed, Wallace muttered, flipping through every page. No mention of her under special admissions either. Caleb checked 2 adjacent years. Aria Bell, also missing. Wallace frowned. This isn't a clerical error, he said. Someone removed them on purpose. Caleb nodded. To erase any link between those selected students and whatever system picked them. They turned to a different section, Helmsford Scholarship Program, anonymized list. That was the internal label for students admitted through unofficial channels, usually nominated directly by the principal. Strangely, that file, too, was empty. Wallace looked around. The air felt heavier, not just from humidity or dim light, but from something else. A silence. Like the walls had seen things they were never allowed to speak of. Then, footsteps. A voice behind them. "You two looking for old records?" A tall, elderly woman stood at the door, cloth tote in hand. A visitor badge around her neck, Hannah Blake. She was a former administrative officer who had worked here for over 20 years before retiring. Still visited the school once a month to revisit old memories. Wallace turned. "We're searching for records of students admitted under special scholarships," he said gently. "Particularly those without legal guardians." Hannah hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You mean orphans?" Caleb nodded. Hannah looked toward the archive shelves. Her gaze seemed to drift into some far-off time. "There were a few," she said softly. "One girl, I remember her name. Evelyn Hart. She was accepted in 2015. Quiet child, sweet. She was only here for 1 semester. Then she transferred out. Just disappeared. What was the reason? Wallace asked. No idea. The system just says personal reasons. But what always stayed with me was that I saw her go into Principal Elroy's office 2 days in a row. Then, nothing. Caleb wrote the name quickly, Evelyn Hart. "Did anyone ever follow up?" he asked. "No one. She stayed in a group home in the suburbs. No close family. After she left, no one ever came back to ask." Wallace's fingers tightened around his notebook. "Mrs. Hannah," he asked, "have you ever heard of the Watch Row Retreat program?" Hannah blinked, then nodded. "Yes, I remember it. But it wasn't public. Only a few students were selected each year. The principal made the list himself. When I asked why there were no parental consent forms, he said, 'It's a confidential talent development program.' I felt something was wrong, but there was no proof." Riggs suddenly turned head, snapping toward the far cabinet in the corner. Hannah followed his gaze. "That's where we used to keep unsorted records, things not yet scanned. I once saw Marcus place several folders in there himself." Caleb moved fast. The cabinet's lock was rusted. One sharp knock, and it gave way. Inside, a stack of thin files. No student IDs, no class assignments, just one label repeated over and over on each cover: internal recommendation. Wallace pulled out the first folder. On the cover, Clara Jennings. The second, Aria Bell. The third, Evelyn Hart. And the fourth had no name, only a photo clipped to the front. A girl with the same face as the one in the final image found in the basement box. The girl with the strange smile. Riggs let out a sharp whine and stood tall body alert, as if he recognized the person in the photograph. Wallace turned to Caleb. "Who keeps records this carefully?" he said slowly. "Unless they're afraid they'll be found." Caleb didn't answer. He simply flipped over the back cover of the unnamed folder. A single handwritten line in faded blue ink, number 5, selected, not yet recorded. That morning the sky was overcast. Clouds drifted like layers of memory stacking over years of silence. Helmsford appeared peaceful, just like any other day. But beneath the gray stone tiles of the administrative wing, something had never wanted to be found. Riggs walked slowly, each paw pressing into the floor, as if testing the echoes of old ghosts. He turned to glance at Wallace, then continued. Down a narrow corridor that led toward the back of the principal's office, near a forgotten auxiliary archive no one visited anymore. Behind a rusted metal cabinet, Riggs stopped. He let out a low whimper, not from fear, but like a signal. Wallace crouched, brushing aside a thick coat of dust from the floor. Something was off. A single tile, older, worn at the edges, stood out. Around its perimeter, faint scratches repeating told a hidden story. "What did you smell, Riggs?" Riggs touched his nose to the edge of the tile, then stepped back, eyes fixed on that very spot. Wallace called Caleb and 2 technicians. One of them aimed a sidelight along the ground. "There," he said. "Scrape marks. This isn't solid flooring, it's a cover." It took them 10 minutes to lift it. The first creak rang out like a whisper of something long buried. Dust rose. The air below carried a stale mix of mildew, old paper, and something else. Something human. Beneath the tile, a narrow stone tunnel extended roughly 4 meters, straight toward the rear warehouse. Riggs crawled in first without waiting for a command. Caleb followed, flashlight sweeping along the walls. Dust clung to finger marks in the bricks. There were no spiderwebs. No rats. This passage wasn't abandoned. It was still in use. Halfway down, Riggs stopped at a recessed niche in the wall. Inside, a small wooden drawer. Caleb opened it. Dozens of papers, scholarship applications, transfer letters, student ID photos, hand-drawn maps, each numbered, each marked, scheduled. Wallace pulled one free, a photo of Aria Bell, her curls tilted slightly, gaze hesitant. Printed in color, clipped. On the back, specimen number 7, accepted. Next to it, Clara Jennings, same format. Then others, bright young girls, captured mid-smile. But the smiles were uneasy, like someone had just said, "Be proud. You've been chosen." A thin bundle of papers sat nearby, labeled transfer route sheets, bus tickets, scheduling. Caleb skimmed through. Each page recorded bus pickups from Helmsford to a vague location, Pinecrest Bay Station 5, rear entrance. This wasn't a transfer, Wallace said through clenched teeth. This was an extraction. A fabricated scholarship system, masking human trafficking. At the tunnel's far end, they reached a wooden door. The same spot where Aria had been found, locked in the warehouse. "You remember this place, don't you?" Wallace whispered to Riggs. "This is where we found a girl who was still alive." Riggs pressed close to the wall, nose twitching, scanning the shadows, as if someone's breath still lingered here. The team returned through the tunnel. They carried 20 photographs, 5 maps, and 9 official forms, all marked "Special Recommendation." Signed. Each signature matched one name, Marcus Elroy. On the third map, Caleb noticed something else. A tiny triangle, circled, in the forest behind the school. Labeled Secondary Transfer Point. There may be another collection site, Caleb said. And maybe someone's being moved even now. By the time they returned to the hallway, the sun was sinking. Heavy clouds loomed overhead. Wind picked up from the west. Riggs walked ahead, ears sharp, gait urgent. The atmosphere had changed. This wasn't evidence gathering anymore. This was a manhunt for a network still in motion. Wallace glanced back at the tunnel they had covered with wooden planks. This wasn't made by someone trying to hide a crime, he said quietly. This was built by someone who learned to live inside it. And that someone still didn't know. That light was now entering from every direction. In a small briefing room at the Helmsford County Sheriff's Department, the silence was heavier than usual. On the table, a printed list. Each line carried the weight of a life erased from memory, one name at a time. 8 girls, all former Helmsford students across a 5-year window, each listed as having voluntarily transferred. But not one had ever been confirmed to arrive at another school. No records, no intake files, no contact with family, because most of them were orphans or came from rural group homes. The final name on the list, Clara Jennings. Wallace held the paper tightly, fingers curled around the edge, as if even a gust of air might blow away the only thread that still tied her name to justice. Caleb slid a second stack across the table. Map excerpts, internal emails, and bus logs from 2015 to 2021. Parts had been deleted. Some were encrypted, but enough survived. Symbols, markers, hidden timestamps that matched the underground tunnel they had just uncovered. I believe every time a student's record was removed, it happened just before they vanished, Caleb said. And only in the years Marcus Elroy directly oversaw scholarship selection. Wallace nodded slowly. Then, after a long pause, he asked, "And Clara?" What made her the last? Caleb paused for a beat, then opened a photo on his phone, an image of the principal's office. This wooden plaque, it used to hang right there. There are 8 small nail marks, like something used to be mounted, but now it's empty. I compared the position. It matches the 8 photos we recovered from the basement. Which meant Marcus had once kept portraits of 8 girls displayed in his workspace, hung like trophies, like a constant silent reminder. Riggs lay beside the conference table, his head gently resting on Wallace's foot. His eyes were still open, fixed on the hallway outside, as if guarding something no one else could see. That afternoon, the team returned to the school for one last sweep. Riggs followed, but this time he seemed to lead them. He turned left at the western wing, the old building block that once hosted special education classes before renovations. On the second-floor corridor, Riggs stopped at a door with peeling paint. He nudged it open with his nose. Inside, it was an abandoned classroom. Layers of dust blanketing the desks, chalk marks faded on the blackboard and on the wall. A wooden plaque with 8 rusted nails. Riggs didn't move. He stood beneath the plaque, raising his head, as if waiting for something to be put back where it once belonged. Wallace stepped in quietly behind him. He recognized that posture. It was the same way Riggs had stood when he first found the locked room where Aria was held, half waiting, half mourning. "He remembers Clara was here," Wallace whispered. Caleb examined the edge of the plaque. Dried glue. Faint pencil markings still clung to the surface. He wiped away the dust, revealing a barely legible engraving, "Special Light Program, Spring Semester Year 6. Below it, 8 student names, all matching their investigation list. Next to each name, a date handwritten in red ink. The last date, March 14th, the day Clara Jennings went missing. Wallace returned to the car and laid out the case files on the passenger seat. He sat still, eyes on the rear courtyard, bathed in the soft light of sunset. Each golden streak seemed powerless against the shadows of the past. If Clara was the last, he murmured, then the student transfers stopped after her disappearance. Maybe she resisted. Or maybe something happened that day that made them stop. Caleb nodded. And Riggs? He led us right back to the place where Clara once stood, once knocked, perhaps once fought back against what tried to silence her. Riggs remained in the old classroom. He sat by the front desk, sunlight filtering through the cracked window, casting a quiet glow on the dusty floor, like a breath someone once left behind. His gaze remained fixed on the plaque, where 8 forgotten faces had once hung. That evening, the administrative building of Helmsford echoed with urgent footsteps. A summons for Principal Marcus Elroy had been formally issued by the county police, requesting his appearance to hand over 5 years' worth of student records. But Marcus didn't come to the station. Instead, he called in offering to deliver the files himself. Wallace sensed something was off. A man with over 20 years in school administration. He'd know full well those records are public property. They can't be removed from official storage. Caleb called the Rapid Response Unit back to Helmsford, fearing Marcus might be attempting to destroy evidence. When they arrived, the west gate was still slightly ajar. A security guard looked uneasy. Mr. Elroy came in about an hour ago, said he needed to process urgent paperwork. He hasn't come back out. Wallace squinted. Do you know the path to the basement through the back corridor? The guard nodded and pointed toward the same wing where Riggs had paused on their first day. When they pushed open the basement door, darkness engulfed them. The sharp sting of burning paper and chemicals hit their noses. Riggs lunged forward before anyone could react. His paws dug into the stone floor, propelling him down the narrow tunnel that led to the underground vault. The whirring of a printer, the sound of paper ripping. Then, footsteps. Heavy, scrambling. Marcus Elroy, his shirt-wrinkled hands smeared with ink, was fleeing toward the back of the vault, clutching a pile of documents and hard drives. He's trying to destroy the evidence, Caleb shouted. But faster than any voice was Riggs. The German Shepherd closed the 10-meter gap in under 3 seconds. Then, like thunder, he leapt, slamming into Marcus's side, knocking him hard onto the stone floor. A fierce, guttural growl shook the walls. No words needed. It was enough to make even trained officers step back. Marcus tried to crawl away, but Riggs clamped down on his right arm, right where the hard drive was held. Blood soaked through the fabric, dripping onto the dust-covered floor. "Step back," Wallace barked. "Let me handle it." He moved in, pried Marcus off the ground, kicked the drive aside, and restrained him. Riggs remained close, his low eyes sharp like a drawn blade. Marcus gasped, sweat pouring down his temples. I just wanted to keep a copy. I wasn't going to destroy anything. But Caleb was already picking up the scattered documents. Many were student files with no digital backup. There were photos, forged transfers, and one list in particular, labeled Next Batch, April. Riggs stepped back slightly, but his body remained taut, coiled like a spring. Wallace locked eyes with Marcus. Why was it always the children no one searched for? Why Clara, Aria, Evelyn? Marcus pressed his lips together. Blood traced down his chin. His hands trembled. I didn't do it alone. I was just a piece. Someone paid. Wallace shook his head slowly. And you still hung their pictures in your office, like trophies. There was no answer. Only Riggs, still sitting there, eyes never leaving the arm that once tried to erase Clara. Aria, the nameless girls now written back into memory. As Marcus was escorted out of the basement, Riggs followed. His footsteps were steady, deliberate, each one pressing into the darkness of history, leaving behind a trail of light. The afternoon sun spilled through the ground floor windows, casting a beam of light down the stone corridor, once as cold and lifeless as an unnamed grave. But the door had opened now, and light, though late, had finally stepped in. Night fell quickly over the Helmsford campus, as if the sky itself wished to veil the fractures that had just surfaced beneath a facade once thought pristine. Officers were escorting Marcus out of the basement when, without warning, he broke loose, driving his elbow hard into the ribs of one deputy and darting down the hallway like an animal cornered. "He's running," Wallace shouted, but Riggs was already ahead of the call. The German shepherd bolted through the darkness like an arrow, streaking past the main building and straight toward the old dormitories, abandoned for nearly a decade. Each paw dug into the ground, his entire body stretched taut like a cord drawn past its limit. The police split into two teams to cut off the north wing, but Riggs had already vanished beyond a wall of moss-covered bricks and crumbling steps that led to the former student lodgings. Flashlights scanned every narrow corner, every broken doorframe, every window stripped to bare wood. No one spoke. They all understood if Riggs was still in pursuit, Marcus had not escaped. Riggs charged through a fractured hallway lit unevenly by shafts of moonlight. The tiles beneath him cracked and groaned under each stride. Ahead, Marcus stumbled, one hand clutching an old bite wound, the other gripping a small syringe. He turned, gasping, and saw Riggs. They were less than 10 feet apart. In that instant, their eyes met. One belonged to a man with the face of an educator, but the instincts of a predator. The other, silent, wordless, carried a verdict in every stride. Marcus scrambled into a small room, slammed the glass door, and locked it from the inside. Riggs halted outside, just as a beam of flashlight swept in from behind. His breathing was heavy, chest rising and falling beneath his thick coat. There was no bark, no need. Wallace arrived with another officer, signaling silently as they approached. Riggs stepped forward inch by inch, eyes fixed on the glass. "He's waiting for the right moment," Wallace whispered. Inside, Marcus looked like an animal driven to the back of its den. He spun wildly, searching for a way out. There was none. The flashlight beam swept across a cracked bulletin board. The words, "Resident Supervisor Office," still faintly visible. The door burst open with a thud. Riggs was the first to enter, but he didn't attack. He simply stood there, blocking the only exit. His chest heaved, but his gaze was steady, as if he knew justice had just taken its final step forward. Marcus collapsed. He slid down the wall like a coat falling from a hook at the end of a play too long delayed. "I thought I could keep everything safe inside numbers," he mumbled. "But Riggs, he's not something you can program." Wallace gave the signal. Marcus was cuffed without resistance. On the walk back, Riggs stayed behind them, his pace calm and measured. At one point, he pressed his nose gently to Wallace's arm, as if checking that everything was still moving in the right direction. That night, the old Helmsford dormitories, once a place where dreams were nurtured, became the place where a nightmare ended. Riggs was checked by a vet. His heart rate was elevated, muscles fatigued, but he remained alert. The vet placed a stethoscope to his chest and smiled. Heart steady. But his chest, it's like he's been holding onto a truth with every breath. Wallace sat nearby, eyes still on Riggs. No one gave him an order, no one pointed the way. But Riggs chose right. Through the scent of burnt paper, the bloodstains, and the silence of those walls. In the soft light of the infirmary hallway, the German shepherd lifted his head. Quiet. No praise needed. Because his presence, balanced between light and shadow, was the clearest answer to the question, how do you know what justice looks like? It's where a loyal life stops and doesn't retreat. A week after Marcus Elroy's arrest, the Helmsford County Sheriff's Office became more than just a place for paperwork evidence and questioning. It had become the hub of one of the largest federal investigations in the state in over a decade. The files Marcus tried to destroy, photos, maps, disguised contracts, had all been digitized and forwarded to the Department of Justice. From there, investigators uncovered transport routes used to move students out of state under the guise of special boarding scholarships. The receiving centers turned out to be sham training facilities scattered across remote, unregulated regions where no official oversight ever reached. Wallace now sat before a map covered in red pins. Each one marked a destination of a victim, or the last known record of a student who had been erased from the system. "This is an entire network," Caleb murmured. And Marcus, he was just the gatekeeper. The first report revealed a total of 24 students had been transferred through Helmsford with no enrollment records elsewhere. Of those, 11 had been located, some receiving care in support centers, others placed under protective witness programs. But 13, no one had heard their voices again. No one stepped forward to claim them. Most had no family left. In the office, Riggs lay beside the window, eyes scanning the back lawn. Since the case reopened, he'd stayed close to Wallace. Each morning, he would walk a full loop around the station, quietly checking every corner, every shadowed place where a forgotten memory might be hiding. One morning, he stopped in front of the bulletin board. Pinned there were black and white photos of the missing. Clara Jennings, Evelyn Torres, Lena Brooks, faces staring back into the lens, eyes still carrying dreams they never got to name. Riggs sat there for nearly 10 minutes. No movement. Just the sound of breathing, and a gaze that somehow still remembered the shapes of girls the world had almost forgotten. The memorial took place on a crisp autumn morning. The air was cool, and the trees lining the front lawn of Helmsford School had turned a brilliant yellow. The grounds had been cleaned up, and the old dormitory building was fenced off, awaiting demolition. But that day, everything was left untouched, as if to preserve the memory that still lingered. More people arrived than expected. Former students, parents, retired teachers. And near the end of the seating row sat the ones who had once been saved, Aria, Jessalyn, Nadine. Side by side, hands clasped tightly. At the center of the courtyard stood a memorial board etched with 13 names. There were no long speeches, no rounds of applause. Only Wallace stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "We record here the names of those who once belonged to Helmsford. Those who once studied, dreamed, wrote on the blackboard, slid books onto library shelves, and then disappeared." He paused. The wind brushed through softly. "They may never return, but we will never let them leave this school's memory." Silence fell, and then a quiet sound rose. It was Riggs. He stepped forward from the back rows, walking slowly, head slightly lowered. And then, as if he knew exactly where he was meant to stand, Riggs stopped in front of the memorial. A student from the choir began to sing. The melody was thin and weightless, like smoke drifting through the air carried by the wind. Riggs lifted his head, his gaze resting on the names carved into the stone. No explanation was needed, because in his eyes, in his quiet presence, was the unspoken truth that some souls don't disappear as long as we remember them the right way. That evening, after the lights in the investigation office had gone out, Wallace poured himself a warm cup of tea and sat next to Riggs. Outside, leaves fell steadily, the wind tapping gently on the window pane. He ran a hand down the shepherd's back, stopping between his shoulder blades, right where the muscles had once tightened in life or death moments. "You know, Riggs," he murmured, almost speaking to himself. "Some never made it back. But because of you, we got to call their names one last time. Not in silence, but in remembrance." Riggs stayed still. Yet in the dark, his eyes still shimmered, like a small flame that hadn't gone out in the room that was once the darkest. Nearly 3 weeks after the memorial, Aria Bell returned to Helmsford for the first time. Not as the frightened girl who had once been locked in a room without light, but as a survivor determined to speak. She stepped through the black iron gates slowly, a beige wool coat wrapped close around her small frame. Her eyes softer now, though a guardedness still flickered within. By her side, Riggs walked in step. No leash, no command. He stayed exactly by her right side, matching her pace, her breath. Whenever she paused, he paused. Whenever she turned, his eyes followed. From a distance, Chief Wallace watched them quietly. He knew what Riggs was doing wasn't taught in any training manual. Riggs hadn't been trained to be a therapy dog, but somehow, from the moment Aria had been found between a cracked wooden door and the weak beam of a flashlight, she had never felt afraid again as long as Riggs was near. Inside a small conference room behind the Helmsford Library, Aria sat before a voice recorder, a stack of blank paper, and a silver-gray pen. "You can begin whenever you're ready," Wallace said gently, stepping out and closing the door behind him, to give the space needed for truth to unfold. Aria closed her eyes for a few seconds, inhaled, and began to write. "My name is Aria Bell. I'm 18 years old. I was once a student at Helmsford, and I was once invited to the principal's office for a special boarding scholarship. But what awaited me wasn't a future. It was a needle and a door without a lock." Her pen trembled. Under the desk, Riggs lay quietly, his head resting against her boot. The weight of that familiar warmth softened her shoulders, steadied her handwriting. "I woke up in a room with no windows, concrete walls, and a stone floor. Each day a tray of food was slid in. No one answered when I screamed. I knocked on the walls, over and over. But walls don't listen." She stopped, glancing down at Riggs. "But you did?" During Aria's early therapy sessions, Riggs was allowed into the room at first, just to help her feel safe. But within a week, her therapist requested that he sit beside her chair, because Aria could speak more freely when her hand rested gently on his head. She once said, "It's like he listens with his heart." And truly, in those moments when a memory broke loose and tears overtook her, all Riggs had to do was nudge her palm with his nose, as if to say, "I'm here." When she finished the last page, Aria added no more. She simply signed her name and placed the manuscript into Wallace's hands. "This is part of the story," she said softly, "but it's also part of justice." Wallace nodded. "We'll include it in the case file. And if you want, it can become part of our school's education program on recognizing and preventing abuse." Aria smiled, her first real smile in months. "I just want people like Clara to never be labeled hopeless again." Riggs stood and placed his chin gently on her lap. Aria stroked his head, then whispered, just loud enough for Wallace and Riggs to hear, "If it weren't for him, I'd still be a knock on the wall no one heard." That afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the library windows, Aria sat on the back steps, her back against a wooden pillar, her hand resting gently on Riggs' collar. Students had begun returning. Life was creeping back into the school. But Aria knew some things couldn't be erased. Still, she was no longer alone in the dark, because quietly beside her was a four-legged friend who always showed up in the right place at the right time. And sometimes that alone is enough to make a soul hurt again. The old Helmsford Library had been restored. The south wall, once lined with peeling wallpaper, was now clad in soft-colored wood. The shelves were scrubbed clean, the books reclassified and carefully set in place. But the most important change stood quietly in the farthest corner of the room, where the morning light was always the gentlest. A glass wall was installed there, not to display prized books or trophies, but to preserve the faces that had once been forgotten. Wallace had chosen the location himself. He didn't want the photos to hang in the main hall where people passed often, but rarely paused. He wanted them placed somewhere that demanded silence, somewhere the light fell just right, so that if someone just once looked into those faces, they'd never forget them. On the day the photos were hung, Arya arrived early. She wore a light brown dress, her hair loosely tied at the nape of her neck. Riggs lay at her feet, his head resting on a low wooden step. The room was still empty, yet already filled with a quiet that felt sacred. The first photo was of Clara Jennings. Taken from her senior file, the image had been carefully restored. Clara looked straight into the camera, her smile tilted gently to the left. A hint of defiance, a touch of warmth, like a girl who once dreamed of painting and autumn picnics. Beside her were other girls, Evelyn, Lena, Naomi. Each frame was accompanied by a small note, their name, age, class, year, and a favorite quote once scribbled in a class journal. Not descriptions of victims, but memories of who they were. In the center, the largest photo, was Riggs. A photographer had come to the Helmsford police station and waited nearly 3 hours to capture it. Riggs sitting on the steps, eyes fixed on the school courtyard, ears perked with the wind, softly tousling the fur around his neck. Just below the frame, a handwritten line had been printed in a script that looked like pen on paper. They are not missing. They were once here. No embellishment, no dramatic flair, just the truth, plain and enough. As guests began arriving, the room held its silence. Some covered their mouths, eyes glistening at the sight of loved ones. A few students lingered in front of the glass, as if trying to memorize each face. A group of freshmen whispered among themselves, "I heard that photo of the dog. It's real. His name's Riggs, right?" "Yeah. He found the basement and saved Arya too." Riggs, lying by Arya's feet, lifted his head at the sound of his name. He didn't bark, just looked at the children with eyes soft like the skies of early autumn. A teacher approached, placing a hand on Wallace's shoulder. "Thank you for making sure they weren't forgotten again." Wallace nodded gently. They deserve to stay, in their own way. That afternoon, Arya returned alone. She stepped toward Clara's photo and lightly touched the glass edge. "I read your journal," she whispered, "and I think you're still painting, just somewhere else now." She bowed her head. Behind her, Riggs stood silent as a shadow, but the kind that listens. Before leaving, Arya wrote a single line in the comment book beneath the memorial wall. No signature, just "thank you" for keeping the names. Maybe what a person needs most in the end isn't to be forgiven, but to be remembered the right way. That evening, Wallace stopped by the library for one final check. The soft lighting spilled across the wooden floor, wrapping the space in warmth like a cupped hand. He looked at Riggs' portrait, then at the faces beside it. None of them could tell their stories anymore, but thanks to a dog who had never been trained to search for the lost, a girl who survived with everything she had left and the courage of those who once doubted, each name had now found its rightful place in the memory of the school. Not to mourn, but to remember. Winter came slowly creeping through the cracks of Helmsford's old glass panes, like an old memory returning. The sky turned to a gentle gray grass damp with dew, dry leaves crunching under the feet of those passing by. In the eastern yard, where the path once led to the basement, a metal door remained, not for function, but as a quiet marker of where it all began. And every morning, like a living clock, Riggs walked past it again. He didn't run anymore. No more racing through the halls like in his youthful days. Now his steps were slower, his joints stiffer, breath heavier on cold mornings. But he was still Riggs. Steadfast stride, calm gaze ears, responding to even the softest whisper in the wind. Wallace often arrived early, sitting on a wooden bench near the rear corridor. From there he could see the entire path leading down to the basement, and watch as Riggs, a loyal shadow, passed by and paused before the rusted iron door. He would stand there for a few seconds, take in a deep breath, then turn left, circling the classroom wing like he was patrolling a memory only he truly knew. "He still remembers, doesn't he?" Arya asked one afternoon. Wallace nodded. Maybe he can't name what happened, but he remembers the feeling, the scent, the path, and the reason he went there in the first place. Arya sat beside him, stroking Riggs's head as he rested it on her leg, the fur around his muzzle now flecked with silver fine lines, deepening near his eyes like time carved into his face. "I once read that dogs who've worked never forget the places where something happened. Like memory isn't in their minds, but in their feet." Wallace smiled. "And in their hearts, too." On the colder days, Riggs walked even slower. Some days he only managed one loop around the school before lying beside Wallace again, his head resting on the gray scarf the old man always carried. But tired as he might be, he never skipped pausing before that basement door. There had been plans to remove it during renovations, but Arya had spoken up. "Don't take it down. Leave it. So Riggs still knows where to return." And so the door stayed. Only the hinges were changed so they wouldn't creak when the wind blew. One day a group of 11th graders passed by and saw Riggs standing by the door as usual. A girl leaned close and whispered, "He comes here every morning." One boy nodded. "He saved someone here, you know. That big case last year. It all started right here." The children looked at Riggs as if they were seeing a piece of living history, something you couldn't find in textbooks, but could feel in flesh breath and silence. On a foggy morning, Wallace arrived late. By the time he reached the front steps, Riggs was already there. But this time the old dog didn't turn to leave. He sat, calmly as if waiting. Wallace stepped closer gently, placing a hand on his back. Tired old friend Riggs didn't respond much. He simply leaned into Wallace's leg, exhaling a slow, deep breath. A soft breeze swept past. The last autumn leaves drifted down onto the stone awning, forming faint rings, like echoes of footsteps that once returned. Wallace sat beside him, eyes on the doorway ahead. "Maybe one day," he said quietly, "I'll stop coming here too." He touched Riggs lightly on the head. "But you'll keep walking. Soft steps just to make sure. No one's forgotten." Riggs let out another breath. It carried no weariness, only a kind of peace. Later that day, Riggs returned to the office and lay on the rug by Wallace's desk, curling into the same spot he always did. But something felt different. Wallace heard the breathing, longer, deeper, as if Riggs were dreaming. He leaned down, resting his hand on the dog's back. And he believed, in that moment, Riggs was back in that hallway, standing again before the basement door, knowing the light was still there. That Tuesday morning, as sunlight finally broke free from the gray, a group of new transfer students began their school tour at Helmsford. Their shoes clicked softly on the stone floors, echoing through the old corridors now refurbished, but still holding their age in the walls. As they neared the east hallway, once leading to the old basement, the tour guide, a history teacher, was about to skip past, quickly, not wanting to stir sensitive memories. But a student at the end of the line suddenly spoke up. "Hey, there's a dog over there." All heads turned. Riggs was standing there. He didn't bark, he didn't move. He didn't even look at them. He simply stood still, right beside the rusted iron door and the aged wall that once opened into a memory no one saw coming. Beneath his paws was a stone floor recently restored except for one small square, a single block of original stone left untouched like a quiet marker of remembrance. A breeze filtered through the hallway window, brushing against shoulders, gliding down Riggs's back, stirring the silver fur at the nape of his neck. No one said a word. The students stood still. None of them knew the full story, but something in Riggs's gaze, steady and quiet, made silence instinctive. "Why is he standing like that?" one girl whispered. "Because that place mattered," the teacher replied softly. "And he always returns." That afternoon, after the last person left the hallway, a library staff member opened a window to let in the breeze. As she checked the unused classroom behind the library, something strange caught her eye. The old blackboard was still mounted on the back wall, though years of dust had dulled its surface. But that day, through the dust, appeared a new line of writing. Drawn with soft white chalk, slightly slanted, centered across the board. No name, no title, just one line, and it made her stop cold. "Thank you for listening on behalf of those who couldn't speak." She snapped a photo and sent it immediately to the new principal and the investigation team. They confirmed no students were allowed in that room that week. The lock was intact, no signs of tampering. Wallace was the first to arrive. He stood before the board, his hand resting on the cold wall. Sunlight poured through the window, landing directly on the words, as if the message had been waiting for light to find it. Riggs followed him in. When he saw the board, he lifted his head. He stood still, eyes fixed on the chalk, like he was reading each word with breath alone. Maybe someone one staff member offered just wanted to say thank you. Wallace shook his head. Not just gratitude, it's recognition for the souls who knocked on walls and got no answer, for cries no one heard, and for Riggs, who listened without needing words. That night, Arya returned to the school. She had heard the news and needed to see it for herself. She stood for a long time before the board. The message was still there, though part of it had blurred slightly as the breeze stirred the dust. Riggs approached, nudging his nose against her leg. Arya knelt and wrapped her arms around him. "I used to knock, to call out, to hope. But you were the only one who heard." Her voice trembled. "And because of you, the voices of people like me didn't disappear into silence." Riggs leaned his head into her shoulder, just like a friend who comforts without needing to say a word. Days later, the school decided to preserve the message. They added a thin pane of glass to protect it from wind and placed a small wooden plaque beneath it, Room 3B, where Riggs once paused, and where a thank you was left in place of the 1,000 things never said. On a quiet weekend morning, while the students still slept, Wallace arrived earlier than usual. He and Riggs walked the school grounds as always. But this time, when they passed Room 3B, Riggs didn't stop. He glanced at the door, just once, and moved on. Wallace understood. Perhaps Riggs knew someone had already spoken for him. And somewhere deep in the forest, 20 miles from Helmsford, in a small wooden cabin kissed by spring light, Arya Bell opened her front door. The air was cool and fresh, laced with pine and damp earth from the night's rain. On the porch steps, Riggs lay curled, his ears perked, as if still listening for the slightest sound out of place. But he didn't need to anymore. Riggs was retired now. No longer part of the K9 unit. No more radios, no more metal tags. Now he was a companion, walking beside Arya on evening strolls, lying quietly as she read or leaning against her leg when the wind returned. After completing her psychological recovery program, Arya made a quiet decision. She wouldn't leave anymore. She turned down an offer from a major university in the city and instead applied to become a volunteer with a community rescue organization. Over time, she was entrusted with a new role, regional coordinator. She trained new volunteers, personally organized deployment zones, and, most importantly, listened to survivors with a kind of patience that couldn't be measured in hours or days. "I don't do this just because of my past," she once said in an interview. "I do it because there are people out there, people who may never have spoken, who still need someone to understand that they weren't wrong for knocking on the wall." Riggs was formally adopted by Aria after his retirement from the unit. Wallace handed over his full file along with an old worn collar. Its fabric faded, but the original tag still intact. "He'll always be part of the force," Wallace said, just in his own way now. Aria smiled. "I don't think he needs a title anymore. Just a porch with sunlight, and someone quiet enough to understand the language he speaks." On rainy afternoons, Aria would often sit by the window with Riggs beside her, watching as the drizzle painted delicate threads across the glass. Some days she'd open an old notebook and write lines she never needed to finish. Riggs always sat close, never interrupting, never distracting, just being there, as if offering a second spine beside her own. Once, after receiving news that a missing girl had been found, exhausted but alive, after 5 days lost in the forest, Aria whispered softly as she set the phone down. She knocked on stone, and someone heard. As if on cue, Riggs gently pressed his head against the back of her hand. No bark, no theatrics, just understanding. At a statewide rescue symposium, Aria was invited to speak. She brought no slides, used no microphone, and stood alone at the center of the hall. Her voice was low but steady. "There was a time," she said, "when I knocked on a wall for 3 days. No one answered. But Riggs, he heard. Not with ears, with his heart, and with something I believe is stronger than any call for help, an instinct for kindness." She paused. Riggs never spoke, but he always understood. And sometimes, that kind of understanding is all it takes to save a life. In that moment, the hall went silent, like a still lake. Every eye turned to the woman who had once been just a case number, now standing in her own voice. And beside her was the dog who never gave up. That night back home, Aria kicked off her dusty shoes, hung up her coat, and knelt beside Riggs. "You got applause again today, you know," she said, stroking his head. "Still prefer this old cushion over the spotlight, huh?" Riggs closed his eyes and tilted his head into her lap. The lights in the house were warm and soft. Outside, the wind rustled through the leaves, whispering like the breath of the earth itself. The little home didn't hold much, but it had everything that mattered: a survivor, and the dog who had walked the edge of life with her. Near midnight, as the city slept beneath layers of hush, Aria opened her bedroom door. Riggs was already there, curled at the foot of the bed, a dark brown shape folded into quiet. She pulled the blanket up and whispered, "Sleep well, Riggs. Tomorrow we'll walk the hills again, just like always." There was no reply, only the sound of Riggs's steady breathing, a deep, slow exhale, like the breath of someone who had just finished writing a chapter of their life. In the dim light of a windless evening, the story of Riggs, the German shepherd who never needed a heroic bark, who simply walked quietly through the echoes of time, continued to be told, not in words, but in what was felt heart to heart. We often speak of courage, sacrifice, and brilliance when we talk about German shepherds. But through Riggs, something else was revealed. A kind of wordless empathy, a loyalty that lived beyond commands, and a healing power born from a gaze that never wavered. This isn't just a story about a case solved or a life saved. It's a quiet proof that love, even when offered in silence, can change an entire life. That sometimes the faintest cry for help needs a heart quiet enough to hear it. Riggs never needed the title of hero. He only needed a familiar path in the morning, a wooden door at dusk, and someone who believed in the unconditional bond between a human and a four-legged soul. And maybe, after this story, some of us will open our hearts a little wider for a quiet being still waiting to be seen, to be heard. Because perhaps they're the ones who will place a paw on the most important door of our lives and never need to say a single word.